The morning began with the sound of helicopters slicing through heavy clouds. Rain was coming and the sky looked bruised like it had carried a storm too long. The rescue team stood ready near the landing strip, their bright orange gear standing out against the dull gray light. Among them was Lena, one of the youngest search officers but already respected for her calm voice and quick thinking. She double-checked her radio, her survival pack, and the small compass hanging from her vest. They had been called in after 3 hikers went missing deep inside the Clearwater Reserve, a stretch of swampy wilderness that even locals avoided after sunset. The storm had rolled in 2 nights ago, flooding trails and washing away tracks. Satellite signals were weak and drones couldn't fly in the thick fog. The team had one chance before the next storm hit. Lena climbed into the helicopter beside her crew, 4 others, all tired but focused. The pilot, a seasoned man with a graying beard, gave a small nod as the rotors spun faster. The radio crackled with static before the mission command's voice came through. "You've got a 4-hour window before winds pick up again. Stay low. Report every 10 minutes. The chopper lifted off the ground, shaking slightly as it rose over the flooded fields. The world below blurred into a sea of dark green and muddy brown. Lena leaned forward, her eyes scanning the landscape for signs of movement. Every now and then, she caught a glimpse of broken branches or glints of light, maybe reflections from gear, maybe nothing at all. After nearly an hour, the rain started. It wasn't gentle. It came in hard, slanting sheets that battered the windshield and drowned out every other sound. The pilot struggled to keep the craft steady. "We'll circle around the north patch," he shouted over the noise. But before anyone could answer, there was a loud, metallic snap followed by a sharp jerk. The helicopter tilted violently. Lena's stomach lurched. The instruments began flashing red. The pilot tried to regain control, pulling at the lever, yelling something she couldn't hear. Through the window, she saw the treetops rising fast toward them. There was no time to think, no time to pray. The world flipped upside down in a thunder of metal and water. When Lena opened her eyes, everything was quiet. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. Her body was half submerged in cold, muddy water. Her ears rang and her vision blurred. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain ran through her shoulder. The helicopter was nowhere in sight. Only broken metal pieces scattered between reeds and murky water. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline. The rain had softened into a drizzle, but the swamp buzzed with life. Frogs croaking, insects humming, unseen creatures splashing nearby. Lena's training kicked in. She reached for her vest, checked for her radio, her flashlight, and the small emergency kit tied to her belt. The radio was covered in mud, but intact. She turned it on, only static. She called out, "Is anyone there?" "Do you copy?" No answer. Only the hiss of rain and the echo of her own voice. Dragging herself out of the water, she found a piece of the helicopter's door lodged in the mud. There were footprints nearby, half washed away. That meant someone else had made it out, at least for a while. She followed the prints until they vanished into the reeds. The swamp stretched endlessly in every direction. Tall cypress trees rose like dark pillars, their roots twisting into black pools. The ground squished under her boots. Every step felt heavy, and her shoulder throbbed with pain. She wanted to stop and rest, but she knew she had to find higher ground before the water rose again. As evening fell, fog crept in, curling around the trees like smoke. The air grew colder. Lena found a fallen log and used her knife to cut branches for a makeshift shelter. She gathered some dry moss under a tree trunk and managed to light a small fire using the spark tool from her pack. The flame was weak, but it was enough to keep her sane. She took a sip from her metal flask and winced. The water tasted stale, but it was all she had. Her stomach growled, but food was the least of her worries. The real danger was exposure. The swamp could drain a person's strength faster than hunger ever could. As she sat by the fire, the silence began to press on her. The reality of it all started to sink in. The others might be gone. She thought of her family back home, her younger brother waiting for her to send a message after every mission. She always told him, "Don't worry. I know how to come back." She'd said it with a smile so many times. Now she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. She took out the radio again, turned the dial slowly, hoping to catch a signal. "Rescue 1 to base, do you copy?" "Over." Static. Then it may be a faint click. She froze, holding her breath. Nothing else came through. She tried again. "This is Officer Lena. Crash site unknown. Repeat unknown coordinates. Still nothing." She lowered the radio and rubbed her forehead. The sound of frogs filled the night, loud and constant. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried. Hours passed. The fire began to die. She pulled her jacket tighter and leaned back against the tree, forcing herself to stay awake. Sleep here meant danger. Animals, cold or worse, losing her sense of direction when dawn came. The night stretched endlessly. At some point, she thought she heard footsteps splashing through the water. She turned sharply, flashlight in hand, but the beam only showed swirling fog and ripples. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice trembled despite her effort to stay calm. There was no answer. She stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just the swamp breathing. When dawn finally came, the fog thinned enough for her to see the broken parts of the helicopter about 50 meters away. She made her way there, careful not to step into deep water. Inside a bent section of the cabin, she found a torn piece of fabric, part of a uniform, and a small supply bag. Inside were 2 water pouches, a flare gun, and a map soaked beyond use. It wasn't much, but it gave her hope. She fired one flare into the gray morning sky. It hissed upward, leaving a red trail before vanishing into the mist. She waited. 1 minute, 2, 5, nothing. No sound of another helicopter. No echo of engines. She sank down onto the wet ground and let the silence wash over her. She wasn't the kind to cry easily, but a few tears slipped down her face anyway. She wasn't scared of dying, not really. She was scared of disappearing without anyone knowing where she'd gone. By noon, the heat returned. Mosquitoes swarmed around her face, biting every inch of skin they could find. She used mud to cover her arms and neck, an old survival trick to keep the insects away. She gathered what she could from the crash site, tied it to her pack, and started walking north. At least she hoped it was north. Each step through the swamp was a battle. The mud sucked at her boots. Sometimes she slipped, landing hard and swallowing water that tasted like metal. Her body ached, her throat burned, but she refused to stop. Somewhere out there, someone had to be searching. Around afternoon, dark clouds began to gather again. Thunder rolled in the distance. The rain came fast, turning the swamp into a blur of motion and noise. She took shelter under a tree and clutched the radio close to her chest. "Rescue 1 to base," she whispered. "I'm still here. I'm still alive," Static answered her. But for a moment she thought she heard something, a faint hum like another signal trying to reach her. It faded as quickly as it came. She looked around, her hair plastered to her face, her lips trembling from cold. She wasn't giving up. Not after coming this far. The storm raged for hours, and when it finally eased, night was already falling again. She crawled up onto a mound of dry ground and sat there, hugging her knees. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the black water below. Tired eyes, cracked lips, a face covered in mud and rain. The swamp hummed with life again, louder than ever. Somewhere far away she thought she heard a faint echo of voices, but maybe it was just wind. Still she whispered softly into the radio, almost like a prayer. "If anyone can hear me, I'm here." The radio hissed back with quiet static like the swamp breathing in reply. And then, silence. The first night had passed. Lena was still alive, but the world had no idea where she was. The second day began without sunlight. A dull gray haze hung over the swamp, and the air was heavy, still wet from the night's rain. Lena stirred slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping on damp ground. Her throat felt raw, her lips dry. She had barely rested, waking up again and again to every rustle in the reeds. Her radio lay beside her, covered in dew. She turned the knob carefully, hoping for a miracle, but it gave the same soft hiss as before. She sighed and tucked it into her vest. The smell of decay hung thick in the air. The swamp was alive, but not in a comforting way. The croaking, buzzing, and splashing never stopped, like the earth itself was whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She looked around for something to eat. Her stomach had been growling since the previous evening, but there was nothing familiar in sight. No berries, no edible roots, just endless water, mud, and trees. She found a few floating leaves and pushed them aside with a stick. Nothing. She knew hunger would make her weak, and weakness could mean the end. So she focused on what she could control, water. She collected rainwater dripping from leaves into a small metal cup she carried in her pack. She added a water purification tablet from her kit and waited. The taste would be bad, but it would keep her alive. By mid-morning, the air grew warmer. The fog began to lift and shafts of sunlight cut through the trees. For a brief moment it almost looked peaceful. Dragonflies hovering, light dancing on the water. But Lena knew beauty could be a trap here. Every shadow could hide danger. She climbed onto a higher patch of land, a small mound covered in moss. From there she could see farther across the swamp. The crash site was barely visible now, half sunk in muddy water. She raised her radio antenna and tried again. "This is Rescue 1, she said slowly, her voice hoarse. "If anyone can hear me, I am alive. Coordinates unknown. Over." Static filled the silence, then faded again. She turned off the radio to save battery. The thought hit her. Maybe she was the only one left. She pushed that thought away quickly. No, there had to be others. Maybe they were injured somewhere, waiting for help just like she was. She decided to search a wider area before night came again. She packed her gear, tied her soaked boots tighter, and marked the mound with a piece of torn orange fabric so she could find it later. Then she began walking, slow and steady. The swamp wasn't easy to cross. Every few steps her foot sank deep into soft mud. She used a long branch as a walking stick to test the ground ahead. Sometimes she had to wade through knee-deep water, feeling things brush against her legs. Branches, maybe fish, maybe something else. Hours passed, and the world around her looked the same. Trees twisted in strange shapes, their roots rising out of the water like claws. The smell of rot grew stronger the deeper she went. She stopped when she saw something half buried under a tree root. A backpack. Her heart jumped. She hurried toward it, almost slipping. When she opened it, she found a torn uniform patch. One of her teammates. Her hands trembled as she searched inside. There was a flashlight, a few crackers sealed in plastic, and a blood-stained bandage. No sign of the person. She looked around, calling softly, "Hello? Can you hear me?" Only the wind answered. She sat down, the pack beside her, and closed her eyes for a moment. The thought of someone else being here recently gave her a strange mix of hope and fear. If they'd survived, maybe they were still close. If not, she didn't want to finish that thought. She ate half of one cracker and stored the rest. The taste of salt burned her throat, but it reminded her she was still alive. As she walked on, she noticed the sun had started to dip behind the trees again. She needed to find a place to stay before it got dark. She spotted a cluster of thick roots that formed a kind of hollow under an old tree. It wasn't much, but it would give her shelter from the rain. She set down her pack, cleared the wet leaves, and gathered a few dry sticks to start a small fire. Her hands shook as she struck the spark tool. It took several tries, but finally a faint flame appeared. She shielded it with her hands, feeding it tiny bits of bark until it grew. The glow cast soft light on her tired face. For a moment she stared at it like it was a friend. Out here, even a small fire felt like company. Night came quietly this time, but it was darker than before. The moon was hidden behind clouds. Lena sat by the fire, clutching the radio again. She didn't expect anyone to answer anymore, but she needed to talk, to say something, anything, so the silence wouldn't eat her alive. "This is Rescue 1, she whispered. "If anyone's listening, it's been almost a full day. The crash site's half underwater. I found part of a pack. I'm heading north, I think. I'll keep the fire going as long as I can." Her voice cracked near the end. She didn't know if it was from the cold or from holding back tears. She turned off the radio, wrapped herself in the thin blanket she had, and leaned against the tree trunk. Her eyelids grew heavy, but her mind stayed alert. Every sound around her felt louder in the dark. At some point during the night, she woke up to a strange noise, a rhythmic tapping. It came from the water nearby. She froze. The fire had burned low, and the light barely reached a few feet ahead. The sound came again, tap, pause, tap. Her heart pounded. She slowly picked up the flashlight, aimed it toward the sound, and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness. Nothing. Just ripples in the water. She waited a few seconds, then turned the light off again to save battery. But she couldn't sleep after that. She sat there, gripping her radio tightly, whispering to herself that morning would come soon. When dawn finally broke, it came with a soft mist and a chorus of frogs. She stood, stretching her sore legs, and felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She needed more water. She filled her cup again from the rain puddles and added another purification tablet. Her reflection in the water startled her. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, lips cracked. She looked like someone who had been gone for weeks, not a day and a half. Still, she smiled faintly to herself. "You're still breathing," she whispered. As she prepared to move again, she noticed something that made her pause, a faint mark on a nearby tree trunk, like someone had scratched it with a knife. She moved closer. It was a letter, maybe an L or a 1. She ran her fingers over it. Someone had been here marking a trail, maybe one of her team, maybe even last night. The hope gave her new energy. She slung her pack over her shoulder and followed the direction of the mark. Every few meters she searched the trees for another. She found one, then another, faint but visible. Whoever had left them was heading east. The trail led her deeper into the swamp, to a place where the trees grew taller and the air felt cooler. But the mark stopped suddenly at the edge of a small clearing. In the center, she saw the remains of a small campfire, cold ashes and a half-burnt stick. She crouched down, touching the ashes. Still warm, her pulse quickened. Someone had been here not long ago. She looked around, whispering, "Hello?" No answer, only the soft rustle of the wind. She stayed there for a while, listening. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they were hiding, or maybe she was too late. By afternoon, dark clouds gathered again. She returned to the higher ground she had marked the day before, following the trail backward. Her legs felt heavier now, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to lose the spot where she'd left her flare gun. When she finally saw the orange fabric fluttering in the wind, she almost laughed in relief. She dropped her pack and fell to her knees beside it. The sky rumbled with thunder. Another storm was coming. She sat there, catching her breath, staring at the darkening horizon. She didn't know how much longer she could last without contact. But something deep inside her refused to let go of hope. As the rain began again, she raised her radio and spoke softly into it, barely more than a whisper. "Rescue 1. Still here." The static came alive for a split second and a faint pop. A click, and then it was gone. She didn't know it yet, but that broken signal would become her lifeline. And as the second night fell over the swamp, she promised herself one thing: she would hold on until someone heard her. The swamp had a strange way of hiding its dangers and its hope at the same time. Lena moved cautiously through the murky water, her boots sinking with every step. Her shoulder throbbed, her hands were raw from gripping branches and roots, and her stomach growled. She had eaten only small scraps yesterday and managed a few sips of rainwater. Hunger was gnawing at her, but she ignored it. Survival required focus, not despair. As the sun rose faintly through a veil of clouds, the swamp seemed almost peaceful. Mist hovered above the water, curling around the twisted tree trunks like ghostly fingers. Lena paused, taking a deep breath of the damp, earthy air. Even though the place was dangerous, she couldn't help but notice the beauty and the light filtering through the fog. For a moment it reminded her of the promise she had made to herself, to survive no matter what. She checked her radio again. Nothing but static. She whispered softly, "If anyone's there, I'm here." Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to sound steady. She had learned early in life that hope could be fragile, like a flame that needed constant care. After walking for what felt like hours, she noticed something unusual. The water rippled in a pattern that didn't match the wind. She froze, shining her flashlight ahead. A shadow moved low and fast. Lena's heart raced. Could it be another human, or just one of the swamp's many creatures? She waited, holding her breath, and finally saw a movement, a raccoon darting across the shallow water. She laughed quietly at herself. Fear had a way of exaggerating everything out here, but she didn't relax completely. The swamp was full of surprises, and not all of them were harmless. She knew that a wrong step could mean being trapped in deep mud, bitten by snakes, or caught in the thicket where it was impossible to move. Her training kept her alert, and she used every instinct she had learned over the years. By midday, Lena reached a small creek flowing into the swamp. The water was clearer here, moving faster over rocks and roots. She knelt down, cupped her hands, and drank carefully, savoring the cold, clean taste. Her body seemed to thank her, energy returning slowly. She sat for a moment, resting and listening to the water's gentle rush. The sound reminded her of rivers she had visited as a child, days when life felt simple and safe. As she continued, she stumbled upon a fallen tree forming a natural bridge. The roots tangled above the water, creating a web of slippery surfaces. She carefully walked across, testing each step with her walking stick. Halfway over, she slipped, her boots sliding on a wet root. She fell hard, water splashing into her face. She gasped, coughing and spitting mud. Her shoulder screamed, but she didn't panic. She pulled herself up, climbed onto the log, and continued, careful not to make the same mistake twice. Hours passed, and the sky darkened. Rain started again, light at first, then heavier. Lena pulled her hood over her head and moved faster. She had to find shelter before night fell. Darkness in the swamp wasn't just black. It was an almost solid presence, swallowing everything. Finally, she spotted a hollow under a large cypress tree. Its roots curved over the ground, creating a dry space. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep her out of the rain. She dragged her pack inside, lit a small fire using bark and twigs, and wrapped herself in her damp blanket. The fire sputtered, small and fragile, but it gave her warmth and a sense of security. As night fell fully, Lena felt the swamp pressing in around her. Every sound seemed louder: the croak of frogs, the splash of fish, the rustle of leaves. Her heart raced at times, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. Panic was her enemy. She had to stay calm, stay aware. She turned her attention back to the radio. She tried to speak, almost silently, her voice carrying hope and fear at the same time. "This is Rescue 1. If anyone can hear me, please respond." Static hissed back, sharp and endless. She waited, straining her ears, imagining that a faint voice could appear at any second. Hours passed with no answer. The night grew colder, and the rain continued to fall. Lena wrapped herself tighter in her blanket and forced herself to rest for a while. In the middle of the night, she awoke suddenly to a sound: faint footsteps in the water. Her heart jumped. She held her flashlight, aiming it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness. Ripples moved across the water, but no shape appeared. Lena whispered, "Hello?" No reply. Only the wind through the cypress trees. She waited, tense, her muscles ready to react. After a few minutes, she realized it was probably a wild animal, maybe a boar or a large raccoon. Still, the swamp reminded her that she was never completely alone. Every sound, every shadow demanded her attention. By the second morning, she had covered several miles, though it felt like 100. Her boots were soaked, her clothes clinging to her, and her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache. Hunger gnawed at her, and fatigue weighed her down. She stopped at a small patch of moss near shallow water to rest and eat her last remaining crackers. She chewed slowly, savoring each bite, knowing she needed to conserve strength. As she ate, she noticed a movement across the water. Faint at first, almost invisible. She held her breath. A figure? She squinted, and the sunlight revealed a flash of orange in the reeds. Could it be another survivor? She whispered, "Hello? Are you there?" The figure didn't respond. Lena swallowed hard and took a step forward, then another. The figure disappeared. She felt a pang of disappointment, but she didn't give up. Maybe they had gone ahead. Maybe they were injured. She made a decision. She would follow the faint signs of life, any trail that might lead her to someone else. Hours passed, and she saw small clues: broken branches, footprints in the mud, a torn piece of fabric caught on a root. Whoever had passed through here had been careful, but they had left traces. She followed them, careful to mark her own path so she wouldn't get lost. By late afternoon, Lena came to a small clearing. In the center was a half-burned campfire. Ashes were still warm to the touch. Someone had been here recently. She crouched down, studying the area. No one was in sight. She whispered, "Hello?" The swamp answered only with silence. She stayed there for a while, listening, trying to detect any sound. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe she was too late. The thought made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to focus. She had survived this long because she hadn't given up. She couldn't stop now. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sky darkened. Rain clouds rolled in fast, threatening another storm. Lena climbed onto higher ground, using her walking stick to navigate the slippery roots and mud. She spotted the orange fabric she had left on the previous night, her marker. Relief washed over her. She had a point of reference. The storm hit just as night fell. Rain poured down, heavy and relentless, turning the swamp into a churning mass of water and mud. Lena huddled under her tree shelter, holding her radio close. She whispered again, "If anyone's out there, I'm here. Still alive." Static hissed, louder this time, as if the swamp itself was listening. Lena didn't move, didn't speak. She waited, holding on to the tiny thread of hope that someone somewhere could hear her. Hours passed. The rain softened slightly, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of the others, the team she had been with, and whether they had survived. She thought about the moment of the crash, the chaos, and the sudden silence that followed. Each memory pushed her forward, reminding her that giving up was not an option. Just before midnight, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible crackle over the radio. Her heart leapt. She grabbed the device, listening carefully. Nothing yet. But she knew it had been there. She whispered, "Please, please respond." The static hummed back, and then a faint, distant sound, almost like a whisper. Lena held her breath, straining to listen. She whispered, "Hello? This is Lena. Can anyone hear me?" Silence returned. But Lena didn't despair. She knew someone had been listening somewhere. That tiny spark of sound was enough. Enough to keep her moving, to keep her awake, to keep her alive. The swamp was still, almost eerily quiet now. Lena sat by her small fire, exhausted but alert, staring into the glowing embers. She thought about tomorrow, about finding higher ground, about searching for the others. She thought about her family and the promise she had made to survive, and deep down she knew she would. Somewhere, far beyond the swamp, someone was scanning the radio frequencies, listening. Lena didn't know it yet, but her voice, her determination, and her whisper would soon become the lifeline that saved her. The night stretched on. Rain fell softly now. The fire burned low, and Lena, alone but unbroken, whispered again into the radio, "If anyone can hear me, I am still here." The morning broke slowly over the swamp, heavy clouds lingering, refusing to let the sun through. Lena stirred, stiff and sore from another night in the wet, uncomfortable shelter she had made. Her body ached in ways she didn't know were possible, her shoulder throbbing, her legs weak from constant wading through mud. She had survived nearly 2 days alone, but the swamp never let anyone forget how fragile life was here. She crawled out from under the twisted roots of her shelter and surveyed the area. Rain from the night had turned shallow pools into larger puddles, and the mist clung to the ground like a thin blanket. She shook herself, trying to chase away sleepiness. Her radio, covered in damp mud, was now her most precious possession. Every time she turned the knob and heard static, hope and fear tangled in her chest. Somewhere far away in a small, dimly lit command center, a young radio operator named Keller had refused to give up. He had been scanning the frequencies for hours while everyone else had taken breaks or left their posts. He had a quiet determination that often went unnoticed by his colleagues. He was the type who believed that even the smallest sound could mean life or death. Keller had been listening to static for nearly an hour when he noticed it, a faint, broken whisper cutting through the noise. He leaned closer, heart pounding. The sound was weak, almost like a feather brushing against the edge of his ear, but it was real. "Did you hear that?" he asked the senior officer who was busy with paperwork. "Hear what?" the officer replied, glancing up briefly. Keller frowned. "A voice." "Barely, but I'm sure of it. Someone's out there," she said. "I'm still here." The senior officer looked skeptical. "You're imagining things. It's just static." Keller shook his head. "No, listen." He turned up the volume, isolating the signal. Again, a faint, raspy voice, a whisper almost drowned by the static, repeated, I'm still here." The room went silent. Every ear strained to catch it. Keller's fingers flew over the equipment, adjusting frequencies, amplifying signals. Again, the whisper came through, slightly clearer this time. Still here. One left. Did you say one left? The officer asked. His voice sharpened with alarm. Keller nodded, his heart racing. Yes, she's alive. We need to find her now. Back in the swamp, Lena had spent hours crawling over mud and shallow water, following any sign of life she could find. Her stomach was empty, her energy low, but she refused to give up. She kept speaking into the radio, repeating her location and asking for anyone to respond. She didn't realize it yet, but her voice had reached someone who refused to ignore it. Keller was now tracing the signal, working with maps and coordinates, calculating the strongest point. His colleagues began to take notice as he confirmed the readings. A rescue helicopter was prepped immediately. The urgency in the room was palpable. Every second counted. Meanwhile, Lena had reached a small patch of dry land higher than the surrounding swamp. Her legs were trembling, her body heavy with exhaustion. She leaned against a tree, trying to rest. The last night had been the hardest. Every sound, every shadow had kept her awake in tense fear. Now, as the sun tried to peek through the clouds, she felt a faint glimmer of hope that today might be different. She spoke into the radio again, whispering, "If anyone can hear me." "I'm here. I'm still here." Static hissed in reply, and for a long moment there was nothing. She sighed, preparing to keep moving. But then faintly through the hiss she heard it, a voice quiet but real. "Lena, we hear you." Her heart leapt. She dropped to her knees, gripping the radio so tightly her knuckles went white. Yes, I'm here. Please find me." "Stay calm," the voice replied. "We're tracking your signal. Keep moving if you can. Help is on the way." Relief and disbelief washed over her at the same time. For nearly 30 hours she had been alone, unheard, and now finally, she was not invisible. She nodded to herself, though she knew no one could see her. Her body felt heavier than ever, but adrenaline surged through her veins. She followed the instructions, moving toward higher ground. Every step was careful, measured. The swamp was unpredictable. Deep pockets of mud threatened to pull her down, and twisted roots tried to trip her. She used her walking stick to test each step and focused on keeping her balance. Hours later, she reached a small clearing. The trees were thinner here, giving a slightly better view of the swamp beyond. She stopped and looked around, her eyes scanning every shadow. She could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, a sound she didn't dare hope for, but her instincts told her it was real. Her heart raced. She ran a few steps toward the sound, waving her arms, shouting, but her voice was barely audible over the swamp. She fired a flare from her small gun, the red light shooting high into the gray sky. She watched as it disappeared into the clouds, praying someone would see it. Moments later, a distant chopper appeared, cutting through the mist. The blades chopped the air in rhythmic beats, a sound she had been waiting for, imagining for hours. Her knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall. She waved, jumped, shouted, and the helicopter's crew spotted her. They circled above, then hovered low. A winch lowered toward her. She gripped the cable as tightly as she could, the adrenaline drowning out her exhaustion. The pilot guided her carefully, lifting her from the swamp into the air. The water and mud fell away beneath her, leaving her suspended between hope and safety. Inside the helicopter, she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Medics rushed to her side, checking her vitals, covering her with a warm blanket. The pain, the cold, the hunger, and it all hit her at once. She shivered violently but smiled through it, knowing she had made it. Back at the command center, Keller and the team monitored the signal until it went silent, meaning she was safe inside the helicopter. The relief in the room was immense. People hugged, some quietly wept, and Keller finally allowed himself a small shaky smile. The faint whisper he had heard, the single word "one left," had led them to her. As the helicopter made its way to the nearest medical station, Lena rested in the corner, wrapped in blankets. Her thoughts were scattered, about the crash, the swamp, the hours of isolation. She remembered every moment of fear and every flash of hope. She remembered the voice in the radio, even if she hadn't known it was Keller listening. The medics checked her carefully, noting cuts, bruises, dehydration, and exhaustion. But beyond the physical injuries, Lena carried the emotional weight of being alone, unheard, and lost. Now that weight was beginning to lift, replaced with gratitude and disbelief at her survival. When the helicopter finally landed, she stepped out into a small clearing near the medical station. People rushed to her, guiding her inside. Doctors and nurses attended her quickly, giving her water, checking her injuries, and asking questions. She answered as best as she could, still in a state of shock. Through it all, Lena kept thinking of Keller, the person who had refused to give up, the person who had listened to a faint whisper and made it mean the difference between life and death. She didn't know his face yet, but she felt a strange connection, a bond created by trust, hope, and determination. In the hours that followed, Lena rested. The warmth, food, and care slowly returned strength to her body. The doctors marveled at her resilience. Her survival in the swamp had been nothing short of miraculous. Every cut, every bruise, every exhausted step was a testament to her willpower. Even as she closed her eyes and finally let herself sleep, she thought of the others who had been with her. Some were still missing, some may not have survived, but the thought of their faces pushed her to hold on. She knew that one day she would have to share the story of the swamp, the crash and the voice that had saved her. That night, she whispered softly into the darkness of her room, "I made it. I'm still here." And somewhere, far away, Keller checked the logs one more time, seeing the faint trace of her signal that had guided the rescue. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that listening, persistence, and hope had brought someone back from the edge of the swamp. Lena's journey was not over. The physical recovery would take days and the emotional recovery would take longer. But one thing was clear: she had survived the impossible. She had survived the swamp. She had survived alone, and most importantly, someone had hurt her. The story of her survival would become a tale of courage and endurance, a story of how hope, persistence, and the simple act of listening can save a life. And though she didn't yet know the full impact of that whisper, she would never forget the moment she was found, lifted from the swamp, and carried back to safety. Lena woke slowly to the hum of machines and quiet voices around her. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and warmth, a stark contrast to the swamp she had endured. Her body ached in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Every muscle, every joint, every bone seemed to remember the hours spent wading through mud, hanging onto roots, and pushing herself forward when every step felt impossible. She blinked at the soft morning light streaming through the window. The world outside seemed calm, ordinary even, but inside her the memories of the swamp were still vivid. She could feel the mud between her toes, hear the endless croak of frogs, smell the wet earth and the faint scent of gasoline from the crash. She shook her head slightly, trying to let go of the images that clung to her mind. A nurse came in quietly, adjusting the monitor beside her bed. "Good morning," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" Lena managed a weak smile. "Better," she whispered, though her voice sounded cracked and small. I think I'm okay." The nurse smiled and nodded. "You're safe now. That's what matters. Safe." The word felt strange, almost foreign. After everything, after the hours of isolation, fear, and exhaustion, being safe felt unreal. She closed her eyes for a moment and let herself breathe. A few hours later, the door opened again. Keller stepped in carrying a small folder. He looked nervous but relieved, and when he saw Lena's eyes meet his shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're awake," he said softly. "Yes," she whispered, sitting up carefully. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it for now. You were the one listening?" Keller nodded. "I heard you. I didn't stop listening. I knew someone had to be out there, and I wasn't going to let it go." Lena's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from gratitude. I thought I was alone. For hours. I thought nobody could hear me." "You weren't alone," Keller said firmly. "You just had to hold on until we found you. That's all that mattered." The words wrapped around her like a blanket. After everything she had endured, after the long hours of darkness and fear, someone had been listening. Someone had not given up, and because of that, she was alive. Over the next few days, Lena slowly regained strength. Food tasted extraordinary after days of barely eating. Warm showers felt like miracles. Each movement of her body, though painful, reminded her that she was still here, that she had survived something almost impossible. The doctors were amazed at her condition. They said she had been lucky, very lucky. But Lena knew it wasn't just luck. It was determination. It was hope. It was the voice in the radio. the faint signal that someone refused to ignore. While she rested, Keller visited regularly, bringing updates and sharing details of the rescue efforts. He told her how the team had traced her faint signals, how her whisper, barely audible over the static, had led them through maps, coordinates, and endless calculations. Without her voice, without that tiny spark of communication, no one would have known where she was. Lena listened quietly, absorbing every detail. She realized how fragile survival could be, how easy it would have been to give up, to lose hope, to let the swamp take her. But she hadn't, and now, she could see the impact of every small decision she had made, keeping the fire alive, marking her path, speaking into the radio no matter how hopeless it seemed. After the initial days in the hospital, Lena was allowed to move to a small rehabilitation room. The physical therapy was slow and painful. Each step reminded her of the swamp, the mud, the water, the roots. But this time she had control. This time the pain was part of healing, not survival. During one session, she sat by the window watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. It was peaceful here, calm, and she felt a sense of quiet she hadn't known for 2 days. She could almost imagine the swamp as it had been, but without the danger, without the fear. It was strange how quickly the memory of terror could coexist with relief. Keller visited again that afternoon. He brought a notebook and a small recorder. "I thought you might want to document your story," he said, "so others can understand what you went through and how hope and persistence can save a life." Lena smiled weakly. "I don't know if I can—" "Not yet, the swamp. It's still fresh in my mind. Every sound, every smell. It's like it's inside me." "I understand," Keller said gently. "Take your time. But your story matters. People need to know that holding on, even when it feels hopeless, can make the difference between life and death." As days passed, Lena slowly regained her routine. She could walk longer distances, eat properly, and sleep without waking at every small noise. She thought often about the team she had been with, wondering if anyone else had survived or if they would carry the memory of the crash as she did. She hoped they had made it. She hoped they were safe. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the hospital halls glowed in soft light, Lena reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the helicopter crash, the long hours alone in the swamp, the fear that had nearly consumed her. But she also thought about the small sparks, the fire she had built, the footsteps she had noticed in the dark, the faint trail of someone else's presence. Most of all, she thought about her own voice. That tiny whisper, almost drowned by static, had been the thread connecting her to the world. It had been the lifeline she didn't know she had. When Keller returned that night, he had news. "Your story is going to help people," he said. "The team wants to share it. They want everyone to know how you survived." Lena nodded. I want people to understand what it's like. Not just the crash, not just the swamp. The fear, the silence, the hope, how every small thing matters." Keller smiled. "Exactly. And I think people will. Your story is powerful. It's not just about surviving the swamp. It's about never giving up, about the voice that refuses to be silenced." In the following days, Lena started talking to the team, recounting every detail. They listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just sitting in silence. Every word she spoke reminded her of the hours she had spent alone, the fear she had faced, and the determination that had carried her through. As she spoke, she realized something important. The swamp had tested her, but it had also taught her about the strength within her, about courage that didn't roar but whispered, quiet and steady, about the value of persistence even when hope seemed distant. One afternoon, as she sat in the small garden outside the hospital, Keller came by with a cup of tea. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of flowers and earth. Lena took a deep breath, letting herself feel calm for the first time in days. "You're really going to be okay," Keller said softly. "I think so," Lena replied, "and I think I'll never forget this. Not just the swamp, not just the crash, but everything. Every small moment that kept me alive." Keller nodded. "It's remarkable. People will read your story, hear your voice, and understand how important it is to hold on. You've already saved yourself, and now in a way you'll help others survive too." Lena smiled faintly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She knew she wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness to endurance, to hope, to the power of a single voice refusing to be silenced. In the weeks that followed, Lena continued her recovery, slowly regaining her strength and mobility. She visited the team who had helped coordinate her rescue, thanking them personally. Each meeting reminded her that survival had been a shared effort. Her courage, the listening and the persistence of others. One evening, she returned to the garden, looking at the trees swaying gently in the wind. She thought about the swamp, its dangers, its silence, and the long hours she had spent in isolation. She also thought about the voice that had connected her to the world, about the hope that refused to die, even in the darkest hours. She whispered softly to herself, "I made it. I'm still here." And for the first time in 32 hours, she felt completely at peace. Her story would live on, a story of survival, of hope, and of the extraordinary strength found in ordinary people when faced with extraordinary challenges. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, one voice, one small action, could make all the difference. Lena had survived the swamp, survived the crash, survived the silence, and through it all she had learned the most important lesson of all, that hope, persistence, and courage could carry a person through the impossible. One step, one breath, one whisper at a time.